Well, Ben asked me to talk about Trotskyism. It's a huge goddamn subject. I think the necessary starting point is to frame it. I'll put it another way. The necessary starting point is Trotskyism is an existing political tendency in the international workers' movement. It's useless to say that because the groups are small, they're not part of the workers' movement. It's undoubtedly the case that even the smallest groups, like, for example, Jerry Downing and his comrades of what's it called, the International Trotskyist Current. Jerry himself is shop steward and militant trade unionist. I've been recently polemicising in the paper against the Japan Revolutionary Communist League Kakumaru faction and its political representative in Britain, John Robinson, Comrade Robinson, and I think there are perhaps one or two other people who support the JRCL Kakumaru in the UK, don't represent serious forces in the UK, but the JRCL Kakumaru in Japan is actually one of the two biggest far-left groups outside of the Communist Party, with a substantial organised presence in the Japanese Railway Workers Union. So it's one of the sort of standard things that official communists tend to say about the Trotskyists. They're marginal, which is in fact in a certain sense true, but no more true now in Britain than it is of the official communists, the CPB, and that they're petty bourgeois tendency. And this idea that they're a petty bourgeois tendency, that they're not part of the workers' movement, is actually an illusion held by official communists and social democrats alike in relation to the Trotskyists. So the Trotskyists are one of the tendencies into which the official workers' movement, in which the workers' movement, political tendencies into which the workers' movement is divided. We might say generally that the workers' movement is divided into social democrats, of whom there are right social democrats and left social democrats, official communists, the Euro-communists who used to exist as a tendency of the official communist movement have basically become social democrats, Maoists. There are still significant and important Maoist organisations, in particular in South Asia. Guevarists, who are another splinter tendency of the official communist movement, Trotskyists, left and council communists, of whom there's distinction between the Bordegists, who are party people, and the full-scale council communists, who are anti-party people. I'm not quite sure which side of the line the commune group falls in. Certainly I don't think they know. It's certainly a left, and in terms of the political alignment that it's giving itself, it's a left and council communist type group. It aligns itself with left and council communism, and to some extent with De Leonism, which was there is still a De Leonist party in the United States. I don't think there is one in the UK, but it was basically a pre-1914 international tendency. And in a sense, the anarchists, the anarchists really are close to being a petty bourgeois tendency, but there are people who are very close politically to the anarchists who are clearly part of the workers' movement. And, for example, Dave Douglas and the IWW people, it's not the case that to characterise Dave Douglas as a petty bourgeois would be crap-like. And that anarcho-syndicalist tendency, as it existed in the pre-war, in pre-First World War international politics, was undoubtedly a working class, mass working class tendency, and continued to be a mass working class tendency in the Latin countries, really until the Second World War, and has episodic episodes of mass support in Italy, in Spain, in Latin America, even in the present day. So the workers' movement is divided into a multiplicity of tendencies, and the Trotskyist tendency is one of these tendencies. So then the question is, okay, where does it come from? Because understanding where it comes from is part of understanding what it is and what's right and what's wrong with it. Background, the workers' movement has never been without factions and tendencies. There is no prelapsarian period of the unified workers' movement in which everybody worked together nicely. The First International had sharp internal political differences between the, quote, Marx Party on the one side, the Proudhonists on the other side, and then later when the Bakuninists came into the International, the Bakuninists, and it wound up a split between the, quote, Marx Party and the others and the Bakuninists. The Marxists were originally there for a trend competing with various others, most of which are now obscure. Bakuninist anarchism is the only one which really survives, though you can find the occasional Proudhonist website and stuff like that. The success of the unified German Socialist Party, the SPD, post 1875, led to a strong tendency towards unification. The anarchists were outside that tendency, and mainly in the trade unions in the form of anarcho-syndicalism, again stronger in the Latin countries. The movement, the unified movement, was practically dominated by the Marxist wing around Kautsky and Babel, though there were other tendencies within the movement. The First World War leads to the big split, which is the split between the social democracy and the Comintern, with the creation of communist parties in every country, and indeed communist parties in many more countries than the Socialist International had ever had parties, because the Comintern seriously set out to organise in the colonial countries together with the anti-colonial movement. Splits have a curious effect. In some ways, they can produce what one might call a negative dialectic, whereby people's positions on one side or both sides actually worsen as a result of the split. And it's certainly the case that as a result of the split in the Socialist International, the politics of the centre group, and indeed of the social democratic right, moved to the right, as well as the Comintern being a split off from the left. They became more openly in favour of coalition with the bourgeoisie, placed more stress on identifying the existing bourgeois state as, quote, democracy, as democratic, and more explicitly rejected anti-imperialism or any critique of imperialism in favour of the belief in international law and the League of Nations, and in modern terms, the United Nations, and so on and so forth. The CPs, in contrast, were based on support for the Russian Revolution, support for the idea of Soviet power, though that became a submerged idea relatively rapidly, the theory of imperialism and anti-imperialism, and the concept of the party of a new type, the Bolshevik party, as an alternative to the mass workers' party concept, which had been present in both the First International and in the Second International. One of the things which incidentally comes out of that is a systematic misreading of a passage in the Communist Manifesto. The communists do not form a separate party opposed to the other working class parties, etc. They form only the section with the most understanding advance of the line of march, and so on and so forth. And that is generally taken as licensing the idea that Marx and Engels and that the Marxists set out to create parties separate from but integrated in broad mass workers' parties, which represented a sort of ginger group organised tendency within broad mass workers' parties. So it's read as the standard trot line of, at least in Britain, of that we build the party on the one hand and we build the broad front party, whether it's Respect or the Campaign for New Workers' Party or whatever on the other, is that this is the line of the Communist Manifesto and the line that Marx pursued in the First International. The evidence, in fact, of this is that when Marx and Engels said the communists do not form a separate party opposed to the existing working class parties, they meant two existing working class parties, the Chartist movement and the Land Reform League in the United States, which was the US offshoot of the Land Reform League. And they meant that they literally did not intend to organise in England and the United States, but that in those parties they would simply be good builders of Chartism, the Land Reform movement. There is literally no evidence at any date after, in Europe in contrast, they did counterpose themselves, unambiguously counterpose themselves to the Reformist tendency of the party of Louis Blanc and co. in 1848. In the European countries, the communists actually counterposed themselves to existing left parties. And they counterposed themselves to existing left parties because these parties did not set out to build parties of the working class. And in Germany, all the stuff which is written about the tasks of the Communist League is addressed to the tasks of the Communist League as creating, as being the ginger group to create a broad mass workers' party. Once the Communist League in fact fell apart in the defeat of the German Revolution, there is no evidence at all at any period that Marx and Engels set out to create an organised Marxist tendency within broad mass workers' parties. They carried a tendency in the sense of correspondence, a tendency in the sense of an ideological affinity, but in terms of organisation, they set out to create parties of the working class. And when people said, like Hindman in England, set out to create a, quote, Marxist party on the basis of everybody has to agree with what's in Capital Volume 1, of an elaborated system of Marxist dogma, they characterised that as a sect. They hoped for better things. Engels certainly hoped for better things from the ILP of Keir Hardie than from either the Hindman group or the semi-anarchist group led by William Morris and co. Okay, so in that sense, the split in 1914-18 over the war and over the Russian Revolution between socialists and communists was a novelty. It was a real question posed that we had essentially with the social democracy as it evolved in 1914-18, workers' parties backed by the bourgeois state, integrated in and loyal to and controlled by people who were loyal to the capitalist state. That was a new phenomenon, and it called for a split. And that split, then we have the Comintern on the one side, the socialist parties on the other side. The Comintern itself then split in 1921 into three tendencies: the Centre, which formed the 2.5 International together with the Trotskyism, and in due course rapidly reintegrated itself in the socialist parties. The Cominternists, who held to the main line of the Comintern, and particularly subordinated themselves to the Russian leadership, and the Left and Council Communists, who split off and formed the first Fourth International in, I think, 1922, which didn't last very long. Which is not to say that the Left and Council Communists were insignificant. The KAPD in Germany was a substantial and significant political party. And there were substantial and significant Left and Council Communist tendencies in the Netherlands and elsewhere. Between 1921 and 1923, in addition, the Comintern leadership recognised that there was still the majority of the working class still supported the social democratic parties. And so we get, and still supported the nationalists in the colonial countries. And so we get the development of things which are designed as tactics to deal with the fact that there is majority support of the social democrats, rather than, strictly speaking, principles of what the party is about. These tactics, the United Front tactics in particular, the slogan of the workers' government is intimately connected to the United Front tactic. It's a proposal in substance that there should be a coalition government of the workers' parties as opposed to a coalition government with elements of the left bourgeoisie. And there's a battle in the Comintern in the last months of Lenin's life and shortly after Lenin's death over whether the Russian Revolution has led to the supersession of the maximum minimum program. And what they wind up with, precisely I think partly because they don't want another split, they're desperately concerned about splits, is compromise deal, which is the use of the expression transition program and transition demands, which brings Bukharin on side, who was the advocate in particular of maximalism, brings the advocates of maximalism on side with what the leadership is in substance defending, which is actually the need to have a minimum program. Then, of course, Bukharin comes to be the person who writes the draft program of the Comintern after Lenin's death, and the expression transition demands in Bukharin's hands takes on a completely different meaning. In Trotsky's hands, again, it takes on a different meaning as well from the meaning which it has in 1923-24. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, the Comintern is at the end of the day built round support for the Russian Revolution. In the Russian Revolution in the 1920s, things are going quite pear-shaped. Kronstadt and the new economic policy, Kronstadt in a sense was survivable. The new economic policy had the consequence that there was a massive growth of corruption in the state apparatus. In order to deal with the problem of corruption in the state apparatus,
Would you maybe explain Kronstadt and the new economic policy a little?
Okay, I should do so, yes. In 1920-21, it becomes clear that the Bolsheviks have won the Civil War. When it becomes clear that the Bolsheviks have won the Civil War, everybody gets fed up outside of the Bolshevik Party. You get a massive working class movement against the Bolsheviks, and a massive peasant movement against the Bolsheviks as well. The peasant movement is reflected in the Ukraine in Mr. Macnair's anarchists, who have been a half ally. It's basically a peasant-based movement. In central Russia, a guy called Antonov, there was a tendency called the Greens, which said fight the landlords and fight the Bolsheviks. They suddenly take on an enormous power. So the Red Army is being deployed suppressing resistance. And the real biggie in this respect in 1921 is the revolt of the sailors at Kronstadt, because the sailors at Kronstadt had been the absolute heart and centre of the revolution, had been the people who'd actually provided the military striking force in October, had provided a lot of the trained personnel to provide the NCO level core of the Red Army and so on. Yeah? So the sailors at Kronstadt rises up and creates an insurrection, in effect with the demand for Soviets without Bolsheviks. And there's an ambiguity of this demand, because Soviets without parties, it's the same thing we are familiar with the social forum. Organisations without parties, in reality, are far more completely controlled by a bureaucracy than organisations which permit parties. So those Soviets without Bolsheviks is perfectly understandable, given what had been going on in 1918 to 21, which was a system of military dictatorship. The Bolsheviks essentially ran, in order to win the Civil War, ran a system of military dictatorship with forced requisitioning of food, rationing, which was also pretty extensively corrupted. There was a massive black market in Petrograd, Moscow, etc., etc. Endless violent conflict with the peasantry. And in order to create the army with which they beat the whites as well, they brought an awful lot of aristocratic officers back into service. They were holding hostages for vast numbers of people who were, to secure the good behaviour of vast numbers of people who were working with them. The whole regime is a pretty fucking unpleasant regime. Now, in a sense, that's actually unavoidable. Look back at our own history in 1641-48. There are some pretty unpleasant things done, and the famous 19th century painting of the parliamentary commissioners sitting at a table like this with a little boy aged 7 or 8 in front of them. When did you last see your father? That, although it's meant to be a sort of a caricature of what the parliamentary regime did. It's actually an extraordinarily mild picture of what the parliamentary regime did to crush the counter-revolution in England in the 1640s. So at that level, in terms of what was actually on offer, what was on offer in 1918 to 1921 in Russia was not democracy versus Bolshevik dictatorship. And in Samara, the Social Democrats and the Social Revolutionaries, the Mensheviks and Social Revolutionaries, set up a government based on the Constituent Assembly. Brilliant. Only it was only lasted a few months when the generals took over. It's not Kornilov, it's Kolchak. Admiral Kolchak's military regime took over to save Russia from Bolshevism, and Bolshevism, as far as Admiral Kolchak was concerned, certainly included Mensheviks, and probably also included cadets, liberals. So what was actually on offer in 1918 to 1921, it's important to be very clear about this, was either Bolshevism, Red Terror, etc., or Kolchak or one of the other generals, White Terror. And we know what happened in Finland, where the Germans backed the Mannerheim nationalist government, is actually 20% of the working class. Not just the trade unionists, the activists. 20% of the Finnish working class was massacred. Similarly in Poland, where Pilsudski, the nationalist Polish Socialist Party, took power. Wherever the Polish Socialist Party actually obtained power, there were pogroms against the Polish Jews. If you look at the national makeup statistics of Poland, as Luxembourg discusses it in her book on the national question in the 1900s, is an extraordinary ethnically mixed mosaic of ethnic communities of one sort and another, already before the Germans and the German pogroms against the Polish Jews. The Polish Socialist Party had already conducted pogroms against Jews, Ukrainians, Belarusians, blah, 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 blah. It was, so the choice which was actually available was a singularly unpleasant choice. It was a choice between the sort of things that the Bolsheviks did or White Terror and the bloodbath. Okay, so the Kronstadt rebellion then comes along. And the Bolshevik leadership chose to suppress the Kronstadt rebellion by force. And that choice to suppress the rebellion by force carried with it the character of the new economic policy, that the Bolsheviks retreated from rationing, retreated from what was called war communism into a semi-market economy with most of industry nationalised. Now, that choice was a choice to retreat towards capitalism, deliberate choice to retreat towards capitalism, but it was also, at the same time, there was a choice to hold on to Bolshevik political control. And why they made that choice was because of the Antonovщина, the Greens, and Macnair, and the Kronstadt rebellion. That is, that they thought if they let go of control, and it may have been true, that if they let go of control, the country would just disintegrate and the imperialists would come in and take over. It is certainly the case, we know from the British documents, as well as from the Russian stuff, that the British had a fleet sitting off Kronstadt, and troop carriers sitting off Kronstadt waiting for the ice to melt, on the basis that if the Russians didn't defeat the Kronstadt rebellion before the ice melted, the British would move in and back up the Kronstadt rebellion, which tells us something about what the British Foreign Office thought about the Kronstadt rebellion, which is pretty much the same thing that the Bolshevik leadership thought about the Kronstadt rebellion. Okay, so the way the Bolsheviks respond to this wave of unrest at the end of the Civil War is to back off on the economic front while maintaining a one-party dictatorship on the political front. And if anything, the one-party dictatorship on the political front is actually strengthened. It's at this moment that the Menshevik internationalist press is suppressed and that Martov is invited to go for medical treatment in Germany and other such stuff. The consequence of NEP, of new economic policy, which is marketisation, is that people are getting rich. Small capitalists are getting rich, big peasants, farmers are getting rich. The working class is still very substantially squeezed. And the consequence of that is that you get very extensive corruption in the state apparatus. The black market reaches its fingers into the state apparatus. And they decide, because it's so politically sensitive, to provide secret wage increases to the cadres and the officials in the state apparatus to reduce the extent to which they are susceptible to corruption. It's too politically sensitive. They've said we're building socialism, so how the hell can we justify the cadres getting special privileges? But on the other hand, if we don't give the cadres special privileges, they're just going to be bought by this or that section of the kulaks, the big farmers, or the net men, the small capitalists. So it's a sort of open secret. It is a secret. The decision is taken earlier than people who think everything happened in the late 1920s would suggest. But there's a real sense that the revolution is going backwards. And the people outside, the Mensheviks in exile, say, look, we said this was going to happen, it's developing into capitalism. Inside, there are a series of oppositions. The left communists started out as the people who opposed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. But as a faction, they survived, resurfaced episodically in Russia through the Civil War period. There's a faction called the Democratic Centralists. There's a group led by a man called Gavril Myasnikov called the Workers' Group. So there's a series of faction struggles in the Bolshevik Party, and in 1921 they decide to suppress factions. After the death of Lenin, the majority of the Central Committee and of particularly the majority of the Politburo forms a bloc against Trotsky to get Trotsky out of power. Now, at the stage at which this happens, it's perfectly clear that why they do this is because they're afraid that Trotsky, as a successful military commander, will be put in the role of Napoleon Bonaparte. It's quite genuine. Trotsky wrote, actually quite late in the thing, that if he had made a military coup, far from suppressing bureaucratism, it would have accelerated the development of bureaucratism. My personal opinion is that that may be wrong, in the sense that If you look at the political evolution of the Netherlands and England in the 17th century, these countries played a more revolutionary role in the bourgeois revolution under circumstances when they were under the dictatorship of a military leader, whether it's Cromwell or the Orange family, than under the circumstances when they were under the dictatorship of the civil bureaucracy, whether it's the Rump Parliament in the late 1640s, early 1650s, or the Amsterdam burghers of the Stadtholderless period in the Netherlands. Yeah. But leave that aside. Certainly that's how they thought, was that there was a real danger that Trotsky would make a military coup and that would enter, the Russian Revolution would enter a phase of Bonapartism, that Trotsky would be the Bonaparte. Trotsky thought that was a danger himself, which affects how his conduct in 1923-24, that in a sense he did not fight at first. And another comment of Trotsky's from rather later, he said of Stalin that if Stalin had known in 1917 what he would become in the 1930s, he would have shot himself. It's probably the case that that's also true of the majority leadership who formed the bloc against Trotsky and launched the great campaign for Leninism and against Trotskyism in 1923-24, that they did not foresee what they thought they were doing was saving the revolution from the danger of bureaucratic degeneration and Bonapartism. In any case, the effect of it is that we get the cult of the personality of Lenin. And we get, it becomes impossible to make political arguments except in the form of you've got to decorate them with quotations from Lenin. And you get also the Lenin levy and the purges, which purge a whole load of people who are characterized by their full-timers as petty bourgeois, and the recruitment of large numbers of workers who are characterized by the full-timers as good workers, so that in a sense one of the things which happens under the Lenin levy and in and around 1923-24 is that the leadership elects a new membership of the Bolshevik Party. And finally, as he's edged out of power, Trotsky goes into opposition. And he goes into opposition, there's a bloc essentially of Trotsky and his immediate co-thinkers who were basically at this stage technocrats rather than democrats. Preobrazhensky, Pyatakov, they were leftists, but they were believers in that the technical elite would show the workers the way forward. And you can see that actually in Leon Trotsky on Everyday Life is very clear about this character. It's a very elitist, technocratic sort of text. But they enter into a bloc with the democratic centralists, who were a tendency which pre-existed, one of the factions which had been suppressed in 1921, who advocated a much more democratic functioning of the party. So they take from the democratic centralists, not we need to open up, we need to abolish the ban on factions, we need to abolish the ban on parties and let the parties openly organise and have open debate, but we must have more democratic functioning of the party, and there is a real danger of bureaucratism, of bureaucratic degeneration. There's very similar stuff being written in the SWP internal bulletin, which we've just got hold of, as it were. At the same time, so this is in 1923, and at the same time, the last real hope of the extension of the European Revolution in the form of the German 1923, the KPD fails. Now, in reality, probably the KPD could not have seized power in 1923, but the Bolshevik leadership, Russian leadership, thought the KPD could have seized power if they got it right. Trotsky does something which is actually, in a sense, profoundly dishonest, which is that he tries to offload all the blame for a series of decisions to which he was party, like Martin Smith in the SWP, by dumping it on Zinoviev and Kamenev. Yeah, and connecting it to the fact that Zinoviev and Kamenev opposed the October insurrection in 1917. He does this in his book, Lessons of October. It's perfectly understandable in a sense. Trotsky's being frozen out of decision making, and there's this sort of big campaign about Leninism, and already the stuff about Trotskyism, meaning Trotsky's history before 1917 when he wasn't part of the Bolshevik Party, yeah, is being thrown at Trotsky. Yeah. But Lessons of October in that sense is a very problematic book, because it is trying to cast the blame away from Trotsky for something which he was decisions he was personally involved in. And that accentuates the factional struggle. We get more of the campaign against Trotskyism. We get as part of the campaign, more of the campaign against Trotskyism. We get an intense campaign against the slogan of the United States of Europe, on the grounds that the slogan of the United States of Europe is objectively pro-imperialist slogan, because it would create a bigger imperialist bloc to exploit the colonies. And in the context of Lenin's polemic against the slogan of the United States of Europe in 1915, which is exactly on those grounds, we also have Lenin's statement that it's incorrect because it leaves out of account the fact that one country could be the first to create socialism. So from that little Lenin comment, which is actually flatly counterposed to almost everything Lenin wrote in 1917-18, we get the theory of socialist construction in a single country. But Trotsky going into opposition, we have, in a sense, again with the SWP, a micro example of what Trotsky going into opposition means. The fact that John Rees has gone into opposition, or rather has been booted into opposition by the leadership looking for a scapegoat, has the consequence that all sorts of SWP middle cadre are writing critical documents of one sort and another, which are attempts to think, albeit they're attempts to think, starting from an extraordinarily low level of political education. They're much less the SWP is much less well politically educated than members of the old official communist parties, let alone the other Trotskyist groups in general, not absolutely. Okay. Trotsky is then ousted from the War Commission and sent to Vysenka, the Central Planning Organ. And when he's working in Vysenka, he sees for the first time just how bad the economic situation in Russia is. And he comes to the conclusion, on the one hand, that they need to plan for an accelerated construction of industry, and on the other, that this is impossible without cooperation with the West. So he now comes out much more strongly against socialism in one country. Initially, actually, Trotsky is not initially an opponent of socialism in one country. There's a book by Richard Day about this point. Socialism meant something different in any case to people in the late in the 1900s and early 1920s to what it's come to mean since. The idea that there was a separate socialist stage between the dictatorship of the proletariat and communism would have been complete nonsense to them. Their idea was that socialism meant what we call the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's just a less offensive word which didn't use the word dictatorship. Anyhow, Trotsky comes out against socialism in one country. 1926-7, the Leningrad leaders, Zinoviev and Kamenev, who've been part of the majority against Trotsky, break with the majority over the increasing rightism of Bukharin, both in Russian politics in relation to the peasantry and on the international front. That in turn leads to a united opposition, and that united opposition is defeated in 1927 And Stalin and Bukharin at this point demand capitulation and self-criticism from the leaders of the opposition, expel them from the party and demand capitulation and self-criticism if they're to be let back in. And Zinoviev and Kamenev, and actually the overwhelming majority of Trotsky's former co-thinkers, comply. They self-criticize and capitulate and are let back into the party. Trotsky refuses. And he's exiled first to Alma Ata, and then he's expelled from the party, exiled first to Alma Ata and then to Turkey. And at this point there's a break. Having got rid of its critics to the left, the leadership now takes an abrupt left turn. Stalin now zigzags to the left, dumps his alliance with Bukharin and his co-thinkers, and embarks on forced march to industrialization and the whole stuff, forced collectivization. Wages are driven down, real wages are driven down by 50%, an extraordinary, largest cut in wages ever experienced by any section of the working class ever, including in relation to Hitler's Germany, is in the period of forced collectivization in the Soviet Union. Millions of peasants are starved, deported, vast quantities of agricultural equipment and livestock are destroyed by the peasants resisting forced collectivization. It's a complete fucking disaster. But it is nonetheless a left turn relative to the line which had been being pursued previously. And it does actually succeed in mobilizing support, strange as it may seem, from a section of the working class in spite of the savage reduction in wages, partly because it had also an equalising, a downwards equalising tendency. The differentials were got rid of, and the managers also got badly hammered and were periodically purged and accused of being saboteurs and enemy agents and stuff like that. A few of them probably were enemy agents, incidentally. We know that the British state was running industrial sabotage operations through the British intelligence services in 1918 to 21. The subsequent documents haven't ever been released, so we don't know. But it seems likely that they probably did continue to run sabotage operations, industrial sabotage operations in Russia. Okay, the expulsion of Trotsky, we get to, is characterized by Trotsky's absolute determination not to give up. Trotsky could have made a mea culpa and reintegrated himself in the social democracy and say, okay, we fucked up. Or he could have become an anarchist, a council communist. It would have been very hard for him to do so, personally hard for him to do so, given all the stuff about you will be swept away with a barbed wire broom. This is Trotsky on the anarchists, and the stuff which he'd written against Kabsky in terrorism and communism and so on. It would have been personally hard for him to say, okay, we fucked up and go back to social democracy or go to left and council communism. But I think the reason why he didn't is fairly clearly that the political situation did not look as though social democracy or left and council communism was an attractive political option. So Trotsky was now expelled from the Soviet Union. He saw the Soviet Union, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Comintern going very badly wrong. And he set out to build a political movement on the basis of continuity with the early Communist International, continuity with the first four congresses and Comintern. So in 1931 they formed the International Left Opposition as an international organisation. It's absolutely microscopic forces, probably smaller total forces than the forces of the CPGB. That's saying something. The platform, they form it on the basis of a very clear platform. The theses manifestos at the first 4 congresses of the Communist International. Rejection of socialism in a single country. The permanent revolution as representing an alternative to essentially saying the Chinese Communist Party should have pursued the line of 1917, and the line of 1917 can be stated as the line of permanent revolution. Yeah. In the revolutionary crisis in China in 1927. And the struggle against, quote, bureaucratic centrism, which is how he characterized the Stalin faction in the Soviet Union and the Communist International. Between 1931 and 1933, Trotsky most famously opposes the third period line of the Communist International, which is the line of saying the Social Democrats are really just the same as fascists. And since the Social Democrats are really just the same as fascists, our fire should be directed principally against the Social Democrats, because the fascists are stupid fascists and the Social Democrats are intelligent fascists. And this leads the line of the third. Trotsky argues against that line, the line of the United Front against fascism. The line of the third period does clearly and unambiguously result in the victory of Hitler in Germany. Okay, the German Social Democratic Party also contributed substantially to the victory of Hitler in Germany by promoting constitutionalist illusions of one sort and another. But the third period line is probably pretty much decisive in the complete inability of the workers' movement to offer any serious resistance to the rise of Hitler. In the wake of the victory of Hitler in Germany, Trotsky calls for the formation of new communist parties and a new international, so that the international left opposition, from having been an international opposition within the Comintern, is to become part of the forces calling for a new international, a fourth international. And in this connection, he revises his position on the Soviet Union. From having said that the Stalinist bureaucracy, that the Stalin group in the CPSU and Comintern is centrist, he's now come to say that the Stalin group in the CPSU and Comintern is counter-revolutionary. In order to grasp that, it's necessary to have a re-theorization of the place of the bureaucracy, because when he thought that the Stalin group was centrist, that is simply a reflection in the same way as we might say, or he used to say, that the official trade union leaders, lefts, Arthur Cook and co., people like Arthur Scargill only in the 1920s, were centrists because of their relationship to the bureaucracy. So the analysis of bureaucratic centrism is replaced by the analysis that the leadership of the CPSU and Comintern is counter-revolutionary, not, quote, counter-revolutionary through and through, etc. But if you're going to say it's counter-revolutionary, there has to be some social basis for saying it's counter. What is the social basis for its having a counter-revolutionary character? The social basis of the social democracy having a counter-revolutionary character is straightforward. It's a part of the bourgeois state, of the imperialist. The social democracy is an arm of the imperialist states. So why is the Stalinist bureaucracy counter-revolutionary? And in that sense, Trotsky has to move in the direction of the people who theorized the Soviet Union as state capitalism, which was initially Kautsky and the left communists. Yeah. But he doesn't go all the way in that direction. He theorizes the bureaucracy as a new exploiting class, a new exploiting caste, which arises out of the role of the state as a regulator of distribution. And this new exploiting caste can be counter-revolutionary, can provide the political basis for a counter-revolutionary political tendency. without requiring Trotsky to say that the Soviet Union has simply become state capitalist or a new form of class society, and therefore without requiring him to give up the defense of the Russian Revolution. Because if it was really the case, and it might really be the case, if it was really the case that from the 1920s, say, the Russian Revolution had become in substance a state capitalist set up, that in reality the bureaucracy was a peculiar kind of capitalist class, it would have to be the case that we'd have to say in substance the Russian Revolution is just a bigger version of the Paris Commune, and it's actually crushed in 1918 as a working class revolution. He doesn't want to say that. Again, obviously his own historical role, but also this is something which Paul Fleur's book addresses as well. In 1929, we get an enormous economic crash. We haven't yet got to the level of seriousness of the crash of 1929. We may be going to get to the level of seriousness of the crash of 1929. The Soviet Union, of course, does not experience the crash because it's not part of the whatever the hell it is, it's not integrated in the capitalist system. On the contrary, in 1929, in spite of the fact that enormous lies are being told about the progress of Soviet industry and so on and so forth, the economy of the Soviet Union is in fact moving forwards at a time when the economy of everyone else is moving backwards, 1929, 1930. So what it looks like with this enormous crash 1929, 1930, and then the victory of Hitler, which makes it perfectly clear that there's going to be a German war of revenge against the Allies, the Allies, etc. It really does look like the Soviet Union is a conquest of the working class. The Soviet Union is something that the working class has to hang on to. And the Russian Revolution is a conquest of the working class. We have to hang on to everything about 1917 to 1921, 1917 to 1923, first four congresses of the Comintern, because the alternative, just as it was true in 1917 to 21 that the alternative was Bolshevism and Red Terror, or one of the white generals and White Terror, we've had a succession of military coups, fascist coups, etc., almost all across Europe, in Germany in particular. It looks as though the alternative is Red Terror or White Terror, is global truth. And that's certainly what Trotsky thinks in the 1930s. Okay. Then, initially, in terms of building a new international, we have a block of four, a declaration of four of the Trotskyists and a couple of other, and three other groups calling for a new international. That very rapidly breaks up. Why it breaks up is because what happens is that after 1933, the Comintern reverses itself completely on the third period and adopts the theory of the United Front, which the leadership of the SWP now passes off on, is actually by Georgy Dimitrov, but the leadership of the SWP for the last 20 years has been passing it off on Lenin and Trotsky. Which is to say that the United Front means we shut up about our differences in order to unite. In a sense, the United Front, the Dimitrov United Front and the Third Period are two sides of the same coin. You can't have unity and disagreements. Okay, if you can't have unity and disagreements, one side will have unity and no disagreements by suppressing disagreement, which is the phase of Galloway mania in respect, SWP Galloway mania in respect, or we can't have, we have to have disagreements and therefore we can't have unity, which is the phase in which Galloway becomes a horrible right-winger and the SWP splits respect. So the two things are two sides, in that sense, two sides of the same coin. And the Comintern reverses itself in order to guarantee to the Social Democratic right that the Comintern won't be a left critic. The Comintern now insists, as against the Social Democrats, that we've got to have at least some bourgeois forces. Yeah? Even if they're only trivial bourgeois forces, totally insignificant bourgeois forces, there must be. We can't have a bloc of the Socialist Party and the Communist Party. That would be unacceptable. It must include the left radicals in France. It must include, I can't remember who the people were in Spain. In Britain, the Communist Party says we've got to have some vicars on board. You know, 'cause if we don't have some vicars on board, it's not a proper people's front. You know. And in this situation, the people who Trotsky initially called for the Fourth International along with, like the ILP and so on and so forth, are actually rather attracted by the Comintern's line. So now the Trotskyists move into entry, which is, the reason is that the left wing of the social democracy doesn't much like this line, because they've been holding to they've been fighting against coalitions with the bourgeoisie, and now here are the bloody communists coming along and saying we've got to have a coalition with the bourgeoisie. So the Trotskyists now go into the socialist parties in order to block with and try and win over the left wing of the socialist parties, and particularly the Socialist Party youth. That isn't enormously, I don't think there's any country in which it's enormously effective. The Trotskyists go into the socialist parties. At least it has the effect that they aren't being beaten up trying to sell stuff outside Communist Party meetings, which was to a large extent what the ILO meant. Yeah. And they have some political life. In the same way, there's a sense in which it's quite attractive to go into the Labour Party if you're a small group, because you've at least got a branch meeting to go along to and have some political discussion with people. You can go and do Labour Party canvassing, say what nasty bastards the Tories are. But what actually happens in the mid-1930s is that the supporters of Zinoviev and Kamenev in the Comintern begin to splinter off. They've put up with a hell of a lot, but when the People's Front comes along, they finally begin to split. The most eminent, well not most eminent, but one of the examples in Britain of that is Jerry Healey. He comes from that wing. He splits from the Communist Party over the People's Front. And a minority of that left splits off the Communist Party comes to Trotskyism. But it's a large enough minority that the Trotskyists grow, particularly in the colonial countries. We've got, in the late 1930s, we have the emergence of significant Trotskyist groups all over Latin America, like this. 500 of them in Cuba in the middle 1930s. In South Vietnam, they win 90% of the vote in the Saigon municipal elections. In Indonesia, there's an organisation, there grows up an organisation of some thousands, which is liquidated in the 1940s. So the Trotskyist movement, led by Trotsky, as of 1938, when they found the International, there is about 12,000 of them. There's about 7,500 accounted for by their minutes, and then there's another few thousand who you can identify from national histories and so on and so forth. And they are a global movement. Right or wrong, the existence of Trotskyism as a political tendency in the modern world is the result of Trotsky's struggle for that global movement. There's a very strong tendency for people to identify Trotsky in some way as a critic of Leninism on the basis of what he wrote in 1904, and the fact that he didn't go in with the Bolsheviks in before 1917. Now, that is undoubtedly true, but in point of fact, after 1917, This is probably just about the only area in which Trotsky is unambiguously, clearly, politically self-critical. He is self-critical, savagely self-critical of his conduct before 1917. He is determined that he is not going to be an isolated individual talking in the air. He is going to try and build a party. And he's going to try and build an international. And in fact, most of what Trotsky is remembered for is his writings of the exile period and stuff which is published in the exile period. The Third International after Lenin dates from his first exile in Alma-Ata. The history of the Russian Revolution is written while he's in Turkey. The struggle against fascism in Germany is from the exile period. The Revolution Betrayed is from the exile period. His writings on the Popular Front, on France and on Spain are all from the exile period. And they're all tied up with this great 12 volumes of, I think it's 12 volumes of Trotsky's writings in the 1930s, the vast bulk of which is correspondence trying to develop, to encourage the formation of Trotskyist groups around the world, to get the International Secretariat of the ILO to function, to carry on factional struggles, to try and make a party on this basis. It's for this reason, frankly, that he's remembered. There is a Bukharinism. It was for a while a little bit of Euro-communism was Bukharinist, but in substance it's a fad. And that's in a sense strange, because Bukharin is actually a major theoretical writer. His writing his critique of marginalist economics in 1912-13 is brilliant. His book on imperialism is very serious, although it's got things wrong with it. The ABC of Communism has things wrong with it too, but the book Historical Materialism, all of these things on their own would be major contributions to Marxism. There are things about them which are wrong, but you have to take them seriously. I think there's much stronger reasons for taking Bukharin seriously as a theorist than there is for taking Gramsci seriously as a theorist. And in some respects, there are stronger reasons for taking Bukharin seriously as a theoretical writer than there are for taking Trotsky seriously as a theoretical writer. Take Trotsky seriously as a historian, as a political actor. Yeah. But the permanent revolution and results and prospects, these are episodic political polemics. Yeah. Why do we take Trotsky seriously? The reality is we take Trotsky seriously because he built a movement. And that movement survives down to the present day with all its strengths and with all its weaknesses. In relation to the weaknesses, in terms of what I've argued in the strategy book, what it comes down to is this. That the permanent revolution is ambiguous and problematic, I would say. And the reason why it's ambiguous and problematic, suppose you take the debate which was actually going on between Lenin and Trotsky and between the Mensheviks and Trotsky and so on and so forth in 1905 to 1907 about the Russian Revolution. What it comes down to is Lenin says we can't overthrow Tsarism unless the peasants come on side. And we can't get the peasants on side unless we promise them to distribute the land. Trotsky says, if you get the peasants on side and promise them to distribute the land, the result will be that any government which you create in collaboration with the peasants will break up within months about the question of because of the antagonism between the interests of the peasantry and the interests of the working class. Because the working class will need to defend its immediate interests, the bourgeoisie will go on capital strike with disinvest. In order to overcome disinvestment, the working class will have to seize the bourgeoisie's assets to coerce the bourgeoisie, and the peasants will be on the same side as the bourgeoisie because the peasants are committed to the right of private property. But neither of them believes that you can progress to socialist construction within the framework of Russia. Because Lenin says we can't progress to socialist construction within the framework of Russia. What we can have is democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, i.e. a better capitalism within the framework of Russia. Trotsky says the proletariat will be forced to take power, but it can't hold it for more than a period of months without the European working class coming on side. But of course, he says, the Russian Revolution will cause the European working class to come on side. First off, because it will trigger nationalist revolutions left nationalist revolutions in Central Europe, which will bring down the German Reich and the Austrian Reich, and thereby cause the revolution to take place in Germany and Austria. Secondly, because it'll cause a crash on the London and Paris stock exchanges, and a huge economic crisis in London and Paris because of the sudden devaluing of Russian assets. So therefore, the working class should go ahead and seize power in the sure knowledge that the question of power will be posed Europe-wide. The difference between these two positions disappears under wartime conditions. Because under wartime conditions, under conditions of the World War, the question of power is posed immediately, Europe-wide. The only way to deal with the war is to overthrow the bourgeoisie, Europe-wide. It doesn't, in the end, happen like that. But in relation to outside of those conditions, both positions are actually wrong. Lenin's wrong because the antagonism between the interests of the proletariat and peasantry is, Trotsky's quite right. You can't have a stable worker-peasant government. Trotsky's wrong because it's bloody obviously the case that in a peasant majority country it's totally illusory to imagine that you're going to overthrow the state without the peasantry on side. So permanent revolution in that sense, making a fetish out of permanent revolution is unhelpful, but it's also actually completely pointless in the conditions of the 21st century because the reality is where are the damn feudal states? Where are the peasant majority countries where the peasantry hasn't been fully integrated into capitalist development? Some very backward parts of Africa, no doubt.
Sark and the Channel Islands. Although they had their first election recently.
Feudal state. Oh, I think that's BS, frankly. But then if you take out what the substance of Trotskyism beyond the permanent revolution stuff, and beyond, for that matter, the question of the attitude to the Soviet Union, which is again now moot after 1991. It's the first four congresses of the Comintern. And the problem, as which we can actually see from the Maoist and Guevarist groups as well, is that the first four congresses of the Comintern themselves, the texts are seriously problematic. We've got an unambiguously false conception of the nature of the Revolutionary Party and of the nature of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And that's interlocked with false ideas about the worker-peasant alliance, false ideas about the anti-imperialist United Front. So that in a sense it's not, at one level, the things which are wrong with the modern far left present themselves to us in England as being about Trotskyism. Why do they present themselves to us in England as being about Trotskyism? Essentially because we have no Maoism. If we lived in a country where there had been large Maoist movement and a small Trotskyist movement, the problems which the far left presents us with would present themselves to us as problems about Maoism or problems about Marxism, Leninism. But in reality, they are actually problems about taking hold of the stuff of the first four congresses of the Comintern, which at the end of the day is about supposing that the Russian Revolution is the model for the proletarian revolution everywhere in the world. And in that sense, as I said, there are terrible weaknesses of Trotskyism. The Socialist Workers' Party is, at the present, displaying classic demonstration of it, which is that it collapses Trotskyism in this sense, because the more that it clings to the First Four Congresses, the Comintern, the more it actually collapses towards Stalinism. But there are also immense strengths of Trotskyism, particularly the struggle for the United Front, both against Third Period and against the Popular Front. The struggle for internationalism. It turns out that the Trotskyists were wrong to try and form a new international on the basis of 10,000 people scattered across the globe. It didn't work, put it another way, it didn't work. Why didn't it work? My personal judgment, it didn't work because what looked like the death agony of capitalism in 1914 to 1945 was actually the death agony of the British Empire. And then once the British Empire was cleared out of the way by the fall of Singapore, the defeats in 1940-41, and the effective bankruptcy in 1940, the necessity to make deals whereby Britain handed over most of its colonial interests to the United States on the basis of explicit deals in 1940 that was what was going to happen. Once the British Empire was cleared out of the way and there had been a sufficient destruction, the space existed for a new phase of growth of genuine growth of capitalism in 1948 to 1970 or thereabouts. It was that which made, well, in the first place, it was that which made possible the survival of the Soviet Union, because the Western Allies came on side, the United States came on side, and the fact the United States came on side with the USSR allowed the USSR to win, which meant that we had mass communist parties, which meant that the Trotskyist International remained marginal. But equally, the boom enabled the concessions to the social democracy, which again meant that the Trotskyists, that the communists weren't the official communists weren't under the same sort of pressure, the Trotskyists remained marginal, and so on and so forth. So at that level, the error on the analysis of the period, which comes from imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, the export of capital is produced by the saturation of the domestic market, which is just untrue. The export of capital is a normal feature of capitalism, which is found in English capitalism of the 17th century, the 18th century, so on. That error results in the Trotskyists creating an international which remains marginal. But actually the idea that we need international organisation, that we need proletarian internationalism, that we need class politics and not people's frontism. The Trotskyists preserved that idea, and I think that while it was theoretically possible for comrades within the official communist tradition to recover that idea by reading Lenin, as I guess is part of, well, let's put it this way, I read early Jack Conrad. I think quite a lot of that is about recovering internationalism by reading Lenin, but there's a certain amount of it which is indirect influence from the Trotskyist movement. And in that sense, John said yesterday, these comrades are part of the problem, but they're also part of the solution. And that's true of Trotskyism in general. Whereas people, it seems to me, who after 1991 cling to official communism and try and make Juche, North Korean Juche, or the Capitalist Party of China, do duty for the old role of the Soviet Union, are probably part of the problem and not part of the solution. Okay, sorry, I've gone on too long. why Trotskyism in Britain? Yeah. The short answer is there are a few countries in the world where there was already a substantial Trotskyist movement before the appearance of Maoism. Yeah. And the Trotskyists turned vigorously to the youth movement and the milieu which the Maoists recruited out of in the 1960s. You needed the two things. First, you needed a Trotskyist movement which was large enough to be capable of doing something like that, and then you needed the will to do it. So the United States left politics is much more dominated by Maoism. This is in spite of the fact that there was the biggest Trotskyist movement in the world, in some senses, in the United States in the 1930s, because the US SWP oriented to the right wing of the student movement rather than the left wing of the student movement. The Maoists became the big shots. The GIM in Germany simply didn't have enough forces to be able to do the sort of turn to the student, to the youth, to the radicalising youth that the IMG and the SWP and the Helioids all did. Whereas because they were a reconstruction, I think, after the Trotskyist movement in Germany had been completely crushed and wiped out. Whereas so the Maoists became the main left alternative. But basically Britain, France, Argentina, Bolivia, Sri Lanka, that's probably about it. Places where there was a substantial Trotskyist movement and it took the youth turn to the radicalising wing of the youth in the 1960s and marginalised the Maoists. Pretty much everywhere else. You either get Maoists, Latin America you got Guevarists rather than Maoists. Like in India, for example, there was significant Trotskyist forces in India, but they were in entry in the Fernandez Socialist Party, and they didn't come out of entry in the Fernandez Socialist Party when the youth movement developed. So the Indian Trotskyists never got anywhere, in that sense. So,
Yeah.
I think that's probably all there is to be said about it.
Right.
Tina asked about the United Front and the Popular Front. In a sense, the Popular Front is an idea that's always been with us, and John refers to it as Millerandism. But it's actually not just Millerand. It goes back before. There's always been individuals in the socialist movement, trends in the socialist movement, who say, look, if you want to get anything done, you've got to be willing to make coalition with left bourgeois forces. What was distinctive about the United Front was that it was saying, okay, the workers' movement is split, we can't avoid the fact that the workers' movement is split, but there are things which we can unite in action on, which are common ground between the socialists and the communists. Like that this strike should win, or like that we shouldn't allow the fascists to break up our meetings. And you can't do it, in a sense. So okay, it's small scale. The National Caucus of Labour Committees, which originated as a Trotskyist organisation, turned into a fascist organisation in the early 70s and launched an offensive in which it was going to smash the Socialist Workers' Party of the US and the Communist Party by going in and breaking up their meetings with iron bars. Under those circumstances, the Socialist Workers' Party and the Communist Party formed a united front for physical self-defence against the National Caucus of Labour Committees, and the National Caucus of Labour Committees was seen off. It does still exist, the LaRoucheist sect. I don't know what it's called now. It's a sort of weird anti-Semitic, it's a weird fascist sect on the fringes of being a religious cult. equally, from my own political experience, okay, it's no platformism, which is very ambiguous in character, but back in the 70s, John Tyndall was going to hold a meeting in Oxford and he was going to bring the Honour Guard. He had a military group called the Honour Guard, and he was going to show the left what was what. And we organised, this was not like A&L, we organised a committee which was basically based on the Oxford Trades Council, which united the Oxford Communist Party, Workers' Revolutionary Party, SWP, though they were always sort of a bit inclined to spin off in their own direction and not act in a disciplined way, the IMG, and particularly the TNGWU, the big TNGG branches at the car factory, Indian Workers Association, Pakistani Workers Association. Yeah. And we turned out, on the basis of that united bloc, 500 people to block Tyndall. And indeed, he sent the Honour Guard in, and they attacked the Pakis, which was a bad idea, because the IWA and PWA were not exactly soft characters. They would have done better to have sent them to attack the students. At that level, okay, it's a sort of ambiguous, it's a no platform, but it's a defensive no platform, because Tyndall was actually saying, I'm going to take over the streets of Oxford and I'm going to do so by armed force. Yeah. You can do things like that, and on a larger scale it would have been possible. I think it's fairly clear that it would have been possible for the SPD and the KPD acting in unity to have forcibly defeated the Hitler movement. Yeah. Of course, what would have happened probably would have been a straight military coup, military police coup, rather than as it got up to fighting on the streets, it would have been, instead of having the Hitler coup, you'd have had some sort of straight military coup. Yeah. But the working class would have been in a stronger position to resist that if they had been acting in unity. But the condition of you doing that is effectively is that you should say, march separately, strike together. That is, that you say you recognise that there are real political differences. You don't pretend that everybody's loving in the workers' movement and the differences have gone away. Because if you pretend that if you say we can't have unity without agreement, it is two sides of the same coin. We can't have unity without agreement, so you can have disagreement and no unity, which is the third period, and we attack the Social Democrats as being as bad as the right wing. In a sense, the British left at the moment is precisely in such a phase of third periodism, that you say, we've got to have a left alternative to Labour, because Labour is just another bourgeois party. So on what basis are we going to have a left alternative to Labour? Well, it doesn't matter what the political basis is, as long as it's an alternative to Labour. That sort of third period, I say third period Bernsteinism, but it's actually unfair to Bernstein. And then the reverse of it will come if Labour suddenly, as may perfectly well be the case, if Labour loses the next election, it will lurch to the left. It will take a little while for it to happen, but if Labour loses the next election, it will lurch to the left. And then the people who've been saying, we've got to have an absolute alternative to Labour, will suddenly be saying, Bevan gives the lead the workers want, as Healy was arguing in Healy's paper headlined in the early 1950s, or Ben shows the way. Support the Ben Scargill-Livingston current, which was socialist action at the time before we all split and went off in multiple different directions. Okay, so the Lenin-Trotsky theory of the United Front is, or account of the United Front, policy of the United Front is very, very clearly, we are not going to give up our differences. We are not going to give up our organisational independence of the social democracy. We are not simply going to rejoin the social democracy. But we can act together on a limited basis, on the basis that both sides retain full freedom of slagging each other off as much as the hell they want to. And then in the 1930s, because the Soviet Union was scared by the rise of Hitler, and I think quite understandably everybody was scared by 1933, 1934, we suddenly get this adoption of this line which says we've got to have unity, Dimitrov says. But the Social Democrats say, you criticise us. We're perfectly willing not to criticise anybody. We'll only criticise people if they oppose unity. And it's this line of Dimitrov's that we will... The United Front is about giving up our differences temporarily for the sake of united action. Which is what all these bloody SWPers writing in this, as the SWP discussion bulletin, or the part of it which I've got a photocopy of. I've only got part of it. That's their understanding of what the United Front is. And it was clear that it was already their understanding of the United Front. It was already their attitude to the Anti-Nazi League. It was already their attitude to their work in the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s and in CND in the 1980s. The SWP went in and became the best supporters of the bureaucratic leadership, of the official communist leadership of anti-apartheid and CND. And it's the line of unite against fascism and so on and so forth. It's not just what the SWP has done in respect. What the SWP has done in respect has the additional character of being a popular front, or more exactly, as we said earlier on in the discussions, an unpopular front. I.e., you get a few vicars on board, only in this case you get a few imams on board, or a few token businessmen, and that justifies you not making political difference with your real people you're working with. And in this case, it's George Galloway. The SWP wanted to unite with Galloway in order to display how willing to go along with Galloway's populism they were. They insist that it has to be a bloc which includes Islamists. Bloody hard to find any Islamists who will actually go along with it, so we get, what's his name, the token Islamist from, stood in Yorkshire. Anas Al-Takriti, being a token Islamist. Okay, then what happens is you get actually real petty bourgeois forces coming on board in the shape of these Birmingham and East London business patriarchs, etc. Is that helpful on United Front and Popular Front? Minimum maximum programme and transitional programme. Okay. The minimum programme is an invention of Karl Marx. As far as I can see, it's an invention of Karl Marx. I haven't found any citation to the expression minimum programme before Marx used it. And it's slightly misleading, because what it means in terms of the minimum programmes of the early parties of the Second International is two bodies of text. You've got a maximum programme, which is sort of general idea, the working class should take over. The working class taking over will be the emancipation of everybody without regard to race, gender, etc. And set in train the cooperative reconstruction of society. That's the maximum programme. Kautsky does an enormously elaborated version of that, which talks at length about the class dynamics of capitalist society at much too much length. Engels criticises it for being far too long. Yeah. But the basic idea of the maximum programme is socialism, communism, and that communism will be achieved through the working class taking over, and the self-emancipation of the working class will produce a free society. Okay. Then the minimum programme in these early texts consists of two elements, and the first of which is a set of demands about the state, abolition of the standing army and people's militia, end of central government control of local government, end of internal passports, which they had in France, nationalisation of church lands. Again, that's a specifically French, well, it was a specifically French demand, but it might well be equally well be an English demand. Nationalisation of the lands held in Mortmain, nationalisation of the banks and finance houses, election and recall of all public officials, election and recallability of all public officials. And so on. So you've got a set of political demands which are universal suffrage, which of course they didn't have at that time, and now that's a demand which is sort of generally accepted. And that set of political demands is pretty much common across the very early Second International, proto-Second International Socialist Party programmes. And then the other element is a set of economic demands which have nothing in common whatever. They're simply demands which have been raised by the workers' movement. That reflects in the First International, the approach is to say simply the working class needs to organise itself for political action, period, and then we'll discuss in the International what the policy should be. And they spent a lot of their time in the International discussing what should the workers' policy about the land question be, what should the workers' policy about education be, what should the workers' policy about Poland be. So that they start in the First International, they start they start simply saying, let's organise. I think the reason why they do that is because the First International, they are actually starting with existing organisations. And they've got existing mass organisations, British trade unions on board. And so saying, OK, we're going to get together and we're going to discuss policy, that the working class should have an independent policy, that the working class should act together internationally, that's enough. In the formation of the French Workers' Party, Parti Ouvrier, there isn't an existing mass organisation. And so they have to say, OK, what's our starting point as a platform? What are we going to stand on in elections? OK, there's the core, which is the state. We're going to overthrow the state and have the democratic republic. And then there's things which have already been raised by the workers' movement, and because they've already been raised by the workers' movement, we can assume that they're things which the French working class wants. So that it's the idea of it is the trigger to start the organisation of the workers' movement in that sense. Okay, so then the other side of it, the basic idea which is here is the minimum programme, really the real core of the minimum programme is the demands on the state, is the demands for change in the state. And the basic idea is that the working class should take over and take its own decisions. And hence the very ad hoc, unprincipled, not systematic character of the demands of the minimum programme on the economic and social side. There isn't a scheme, there is no Marxist scheme about what the future society will be like. That's what the maximum minimum programme is telling us. It's telling us that there's a basic principled idea, which is the maximum programme, and then there's minimum demands which are about the working class taking political power. Okay, then in essence what happens is that the social democratic leadership in the 1890s and 1900s de-guts the minimum programme. And how it de-guts the minimum programme is by, there's two, as it were, stages to it. The first of which is Kautsky on parliamentarism and socialism and on the agrarfrage, on the agrarian question, develops this idea that basically the democratic republic means parliamentarism. There's got to be a parliament, there's got to be rules of law, there's got to be a judiciary, there's got to be a central bureaucracy. These are just, Kautsky says, just necessary features of modern society. The Weberians make the point much more strongly. They say elitism is a necessary feature, technocratic elite is a necessary feature of modern industrial society. So, okay, why have we got these demands about the democratic questions in the programme if it's not the democratic republic is counterposed to the bureaucratic rule of law state? Kautsky explains that in The Social Revolution by saying the democratic demands are the demands of the bourgeois revolution, of the uncompleted bourgeois revolution. And we have to fight for these in order to complete the bourgeois revolution. Okay, so now after Kautsky has done this, we get people opposing right-wing, this very rather right-wing version of the minimum maximum divide by saying what we have to say is socialism now, the maximum programme, and nothing but the maximum programme. Now, that's one line of attack. The Bulgarian narrow socialists have that character. They become the Bulgarian Communist Party. The Socialist Party of Great Britain, if people encounter the Socialist Party of Great Britain. Yeah. The maximum programme and nothing but the maximum programme, and we will do nothing except propagandise for the maximum programme until everybody agrees. When everybody agrees with the maximum programme, then we will create socialism because everybody agrees with it, or the large majority agrees with it. That's one line of alternative to Kautsky's version of the minimum programme. The other line of alternative is the syndicalists, the left syndicalists, the general strike. Because if we get people into the general strike in itself, they will be forced to take over the running of society. And that gets rid of these careerist bastards who are actually running the socialist parties. It's direct from the general strike, we move into direct self-management of the factories. Now, in fact, this is Bakunin's line, but I think by the 1900s, people had almost forgotten that it was Bakunin's line. Well, I think actually the Trots completely now have forgotten that it's Bakunin's line because it's the line they defend, but they wouldn't call themselves Bakuninists. Sorel, for example, in Reflections on Violence, you will not find Bakunin cited anywhere. The left syndicalists say that it is in fact from Bakunin to the Italian, French and Italian anarchists, and from the French and Italian anarchists to anarcho-syndicalism in the 1890s, to revolutionary syndicalism in the 1900s. And the idea is simply, once you get the masses into action, they will reconstruct society. And you get the masses into action. Sorel says the general strike is a myth. It's the mythos which allows you to have a revolutionary syndicalist project. It's the mythos which makes every strike potentially a violent strike and a confrontation with the bourgeois state. Now that alternative line, as opposed to the Max-Min programme, is actually defended in a diluted form by a whole load of people who are within the mainstream socialist parties who would regard themselves as Marxists. The Dutch in particular, what the hell's the guy's name? Not Paniker, Gorter, who Lenin characterises Pannekoek and Gorter as the left-wing communism of young men. well, okay, Pannekoek is younger than Lenin. Gorta is in fact older than Lenin and been active in the socialist movement longer than Lenin. So it's the infantile disorder is the infantile disorder of an old existing tendency. Gorta argued the general strike line in the Second International in the 1890s, and Luxembourg has a diluted version of it. The Russian economists, the left wing of the Russian economists, also had a diluted version of it. Trotsky in 1904 in Our Political Tasks essentially has again a diluted version of it. Mobilise the masses. The A and the Z of our political line is mobilise the masses. If we mobilise the masses will solve political problems. Okay, so we've got the two things of maximalism on the one hand and general strikeism on the other. Yeah. And then on top of that, Bukharin, it's an extremely common response to Kautsky and to Kautsky's scabbing in 1914, is to say the problem is they always had this thing of the minimum program, which was what they really fought on, and the maximum program, precisely because Kautsky has identified the minimum program with the uncompleted tasks of the bourgeois revolution. Yeah. What's the task of the socialist revolution? Well, they must be the maximum program. Yeah. So Bukharin and his co-thinkers argue for a maximum program. And they start that argument in 1917. They say, look, the war makes it clear that the socialist revolution is on the agenda, not anything less, and therefore the minimum program is obsolete. And Lenin says, no, the minimum program isn't obsolete. We aren't in power. They begin it again in 1918. The minimum program is obsolete because we're in power now. And Lenin says, no, the minimum program is not obsolete because we may lose power. Yeah. And that debate is running through in the 1920s, minimum program, maximum program. In addition to which there's the debate about the trade union program, which the Germans developed this program for the trade unions, which is designed to be a program for united front orientation in the German trade union movement. Yeah. Which is where sliding scale of wages, sliding scale of hours, where they come from. They are demands which the masses raised in Germany in 1916 to 1918. Why did they do so? Because the economic conditions in Germany in 1916 to 18 in wartime were characterized by hyperinflation, or not hyperinflation, but serious inflation, and simultaneously dislocation of the economy as a result of the Allied blockade and unemployment. So we get the idea of a program which will bridge the gap between the minimum program, which is blamed for the scabbing of the Social Democrats, and the maximum program, which is socialist construction. And in a sense, again, take it in the context of 1918 to 21, what follows from the Russian Revolution fairly rapidly is war communism. War communism, i.e. the state takes over everything, there's rationing, theoretically direct management by Soviets and workers' control, though in practice the Bolsheviks have moved away from that from March, April 1918 in favour of professionalised management. So we can imagine the socialist revolution, that the socialist revolution will lead immediately into war communism. Hard to relate that to NEP, but then the Germans could say, well, NEP, we only have to have NEP because Russia is so backward. If we had a revolution in an advanced capitalist country, we would go to war communism and stay in war communism. Hence, the minimum-maximum division is superseded. But that gets mixed up with, simultaneously, the general strike idea, the idea that essentially it's about mobilise the masses and that will sort the problems out. Yeah. So you've got these two ideas which are in transitional program, one of which is the distinction between dictatorship and the proletariat and communism is gone. We go for the maximum program straight away, which actually, if you do it, what you get is Cambodia year zero, or the Chinese Cultural Revolution, or the period of forced collectivization. The other is we need a program which will go straight from trade union struggle, from the trade union struggle to the general strike, and from the general strike to the Soviets, and from Soviets to the seizure of power. And the centrality of the sliding scale of wages, sliding scale of hours, okay, it arises out of the conditions of 1916, 1918. It probably would have been an attractive idea in Britain in 1916, 1918, because Britain had the same problems for slightly different reasons. Namely, submarine warfare was leading to disruption of the economy, and there was also inflation, though it wasn't anything like as serious as Germany. 1939 to 45, it has absolutely no purchase whatever, and the reason why is because all the belligerents go immediately to industrial conscription and generalised directive planning of industry and full-scale rationing. So in a sense we have war communism, and there are people who think like this about Britain in 1940 to 45. Britain in 1940-45 is like what socialism would be like. Wow, bombs falling on you. There really are people. There's a guy called David Fernbach who wrote the translation of the Penguin translation of Marx's Capital. Wrote a book called The Spiral Path, which has that sort of general character. But the consequence of it, however, is that the whole transitional program, it doesn't really have legs, that side of it. So what people do is, okay, on what basis can we mobilise the masses? Well, people are prepared to go on strike for more pay, so more pay. Whatever looks like it's going to be an attractive demand at the particular moment in time becomes the programme. The SWP, Cliff, I think, reached the logical conclusion from this, which is you don't have a programme at all. It's just a question of having a nose.
Lenin had a good nose.
Lenin had a good nose, and Cliff thought he had a good nose. John Ross thought he had a good nose. At that point you get to the reductio ad absurdum. The IMG was characterised by John Ross's, following John Ross's nose. At least Cliff stuck with a line for a couple of years. John Ross, as often as not, would change his mind between the beginning of the meeting and the end of the meeting.
As a heightened sense of smell.
A very heightened sense of smell. Is that enough on that? I think the one thing, other thing to say about it is, look, this is not Trotsky. It's commonly regarded as being Trotsky, that the unique feature of Trotskyism is the transitional program. But it's actually just Trotsky taking stuff from the Fourth Congress of the Comintern. He is a party to those decisions. There's a drafting committee of Trotsky, Lenin, Bukharin, Zinoviev, a couple of other people who drafts up this idea of transitional program. But it's not original, it's not something which Trotskyism has separately from the early Comintern. It's part of the early Comintern's ideas.
Maybe you could talk a bit about how this is used today still, the transitional program as a way, not to talk about the maximum program in that sense.
Yes, it's very difficult to be clear because the things that people do with it are very variable. Like for the Mandelites, the idea of a transitional program, or the quote transitional method, it's like Cliff and his nose, albeit it works differently. Yeah, works slightly differently. On the other hand, the Sparts and a lot of other people, you would get the 1938 program is the epitome of what's needed, and therefore you get an article with a long list of, quote, transitional demands at the end of it. Yeah. That is, I think, also true of people like Savas Michael and the Greek EEK, the Helioites, or not ex-Helioites, and the Franco, the Partito Comunista di Lavoro in Italy, the Altamirano tendency. I will talk a bit more about tendencies in a minute. And Jerry Downing. Yeah. So there's a lot of people who use it in that way. Yeah. I think it's mainly the idea of the, quote, transitional method. And so the 35-hour week is a, quote, transitional demand. Why is it a transitional demand? Well, it's because it's a demand for reduction of working hours. Excuse me, how does that... The sliding scale of hours, we can see perfectly clearly why it is a demand which can be said to bridge the difference between the minimum and the maximum program. Because if it's really the case that there's going to be work for all on the basis of we reduce hours as much as is necessary to make sure that everybody's in work, yeah, we can't actually do that without directive central planning. Yeah. So the sliding scale, plus it actually amounts to the abolition of money. Sliding scale of wages, sliding scale of hours, take this stuff together, it actually amounts to the abolition of money. Because you're planning directly with physical resources. Now, circumstances may be such that the slogan of the abolition of money has a certain degree of purchase. Now, right now, in a sense, ideas around the abolition of money have a certain degree of purchase because the relationships between money and material, physical values, use values, have gone fucking crazy. Yeah? You've got, in that sense, a deep crisis of money as such. Yeah. And that's partly why I said in yesterday's meeting that we can't just denounce the transitional program type programs which AWL, etc. put forward, because in terms of a program of action for action on a European scale, it's not wholly senseless. There is a senseless aspect about it, which is that rather than saying up front to the working class, look, the money system is fucked up, we need to find some way of solving the economic problems without using it, yeah, which then has to pose the question of democracy and democratic planning and so on and so forth. What you're essentially doing is trying to con the working class into saying, this is really a brilliant demand for increasing wages, sliding scale of wages. We have sliding scale of wages, you aren't going to have to fight over wage demands every year. Yeah, really. But then when you actually look at it closely, if we implement this demand, we've abolished money. Have you actually persuaded the working class that abolishing money is a good idea? No. So the USEC has actually correctly criticised the SWP for having a perspective of conning the working class into taking power. Yeah. And that's in substance what this amounts to. Okay, then we don't actually use the demands of the 1938 programme. We use whatever the hell looks popular. 35-hour week was popular a few years back. European decency, minimum wage set at the European decency level. Yeah. Yeah. In a sense, actually, there's nothing wrong with using demands like 35-hour week because they're popular. Yeah. It's just agitation. It's not a program. It's not a strategic orientation, and it's essentially what's going on with this stuff to a considerable extent is substituting. We've got to agitate, again, very clear in the SWP documents. they're each accusing the other side. Each side's accusing, you'll reduce us to propagandism. Well, sorry, sunshine. Actually, you're a group of a few thousand. That is objectively a propaganda group. Yeah. Yes, you can do limited amounts of agitation. It's legitimate to do limited amounts of agitation. But that you are objectively a propaganda group. And the trouble with you is you aren't doing decent bloody propaganda. Yeah. Is that... Yeah, okay. Peasants and workers. It's not exactly simply the private property question. The problem is, suppose that you have, well, there's two aspects to it. The first is, suppose you have collectivist peasantry like the Russian Mir or the Russian Commune. Yeah. They had periodic redistribution of the land. But actually what that means is the land belongs to the village as against the individuals, but also as against any outsiders. Yeah. Okay, so now suppose we get rid of the state and we just have a collectivist anarchism of peasant communes. Over the hill, or out in the Gobi, not the Gobi, but out in on the plains, there are people who live not by peasant cultivation, repartitioning the land, but by cattle herding. And if there's a drought, these people are going to want to come and parasitise on the peasants. Who's going to stop them doing so? The peasants aren't going to stop them doing so because living by cattle herding is militarily, it means you've got cavalry and your opponent got infantry, you've got bows and arrows, and your opponents who live by peasantry have got no reason to have bows and arrows. You live doing quasi-military activities. So you take the state away, take the ruling class away, actually a pure peasant pure society of peasant collectives will simply be conquered by the neighbouring cattle nomads. Yeah? If it wasn't, if it isn't people from the plains or riding on horseback, it'll be people from the hills, or people from the sea, for that matter. The pure peasant society you did have, for practical purposes, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in Britain, for a period of time, a pure peasant society in lowland England, and the bloody Anglo-Saxons, the Scythe, came in from the sea and conquered them, and the Welsh from the hills in parts. So the consequence is actually that a peasant collectivism, even a peasant collectivism, can't run society in that sense. There has to be a ruling class or state over on top of it. Second side of it, who does the work? Peasant household, who does the work?
Family.
The
family.
The family, yeah. Who owns the outcome?
Well, it's theirs, but then they give up a certain
household.
Yeah.
The father.
Father, yeah.
So peasant society actually lives by the exploitation of female and child labour. It's never the case that you have a peasant society in which there is nothing below the class of peasants. The class of peasants is the class of male fathers and heads of households. And it's an exploiting class. So that the contradiction between the interests of the peasantry and the interests of the proletariat as a class is male and female and youth and old, all in various different ways being exploited by capital through the relationship of labour, the exploitative wage relationship. So the interest of the proletariat in having an effective resistance against capital is to have unity of men and women, of the youth and the old, of the apprentices and the grown-up workers and so on and so forth. And that interest is directly opposed to the interest of the peasant in the exploitation of his wife and children. That's a simple, is actually the case. Okay, it may be the case that if you're under a tyrannical feudal regime and so on and so forth, the working class and the peasantry, and in fact the bourgeoisie as well, all have a common interest in overthrowing that regime. But that doesn't alter the fact that actually if you look at the social relations of peasant society, in the first place the social relations of peasant society are such that the peasantry can't be free. They've got to have somebody above them forcing them to give up part of their surplus in order that there shall be soldiers to hold the cattle nomads off their backs. And secondly, they are actually an exploiting class. Although they're an exploited class, they are also an exploiting class. If you take away the exploitation of the peasantry, they're still there, they're an exploiting class. So is that helpful?
Yeah.
That is probably something which, that is not a common CPGB position, that's just me. Bureaucratic centralism is not exclusive to Trotskyist groups. So there are any particular peculiarities of Trotskyist groups in relation to this? Well, yes and no. In the first place, there is a contradiction present in bureaucratic centralism in Trotskyist groups, which is not present in bureaucratic centralism in left Stalinist or Maoist groups. And that contradiction is that the original Trotskyists were factionalists, and indeed disloyal factionalists. Why was Trotsky expelled from the Communist Party? He was expelled from the Communist Party for organising a counter-demonstration to the Communist Party's official May Day demonstration. That's a fact. So that even when Trotskyists say, oh, we're against factions and so on and so forth, there's a conflict. There's an inherent conflict. Usually what they say is, we're not against factions, but they have to be controlled. SWP, we're not against factions, but they have to take place only in the pre-conference period. We're not against factions as long as nobody engages in correspondence, horizontal correspondence with members of other branches, because horizontal correspondence with members of other branches is not letting the party as a whole in on what you're saying. So we've got various mechanisms for saying we have factions. Yes, of course we can have factions, but only under those conditions that they won't disrupt the unity of the party. So that contradiction is there, and again you can see it in the SWP. They're hung up, these people in the SWP discussion, they're totally hung up on this contradiction between, on the one hand they think, wow, the SWP survived where the IMG fell apart, and that's because we banned factions or we prevented factionalism. This is in fact bullshit. The IMG fell apart not because the IMG went on for 10 years with savage faction fighting without, the savage faction fighting started in 69, the organisation didn't fall apart until 86. If anything, the stronger the factional struggle, the stronger the organisation was, because the factional struggle was one of the major motivators for people to learn about Marxism in order to participate effectively in the factional struggle. The contradiction between the different views of different members of the leadership, the fact that you get Tarek saying one thing and John Ross saying another thing and Ernest saying one thing and Joe Hansen saying something else completely different, motivated people to learn and think about Marxism and to be better Marxists. And indeed, the factional struggle led people on both sides to recruit people into the organisation, and on factional lines, to build up their own factions. But the effect of it was to build up the organisation. Yeah. So the SWP has this extraordinary illusion. Yeah. Okay, the other side of the coin to this, however, is this. The Stalinists, people who come out of Stalinism to criticise Stalinism, are aware that what they've been doing is Stalinism. Yeah. Whereas Trotskyists very often aren't aware that what they've been doing is Stalinism. They can go through life doing Stalinism. You know, you could take, with again the SWP, the American SWP finally became aware of it and ceased to be a Trotskyist organisation. But you could go to the SWP leaders and quote J.B. Stalin at them and say, who wrote that?
John Rees?
John Rees, yeah. Alex Klinikos. So, in that sense, there's a paradox, because it can be the case that it's actually easier for ex-Maoists to criticise bureaucratic centralism than for Trotskyists, because they don't recognise that what they're doing is bureaucratic centralism. You know, they think of it as being Trotskyism. Is that...
What's democratic centralism?
Well, okay. Democratic centralism, Lenin, the expression is introduced into the Russian RSDLP by the Mensheviks. The Menshevik Conference of 1906 says that the party organisations should be democratic centralist. Where does it come from? Probably from Schweitzer, from the Lassalleans. Nobody's actually done the tracing, but it's probably from the stuff. The Lassalleans said we have to have a centralist party, and that means we have a referendum to elect a leader, and once the leader has been elected, he's in charge of all the local organisations, etc., etc. He appoints people downwards. And that may be what was called democratic, maybe that's was called what was called democratic centralism. I don't know, and I think that there is evidence available to a German speaker about the origins of the word democratic centralism in the SPD, that it probably comes from the Lassallean side and from the stuff that Marx and Engels criticised as Bonapartist. Okay, then Lenin tells us that the new Russian Republic, we should have a democratic centralist republic. What does he mean by that? What he means by that, we don't want federalism. We don't want Swiss-style federalism or German-style federalism, as it was the Second Reich was a federalist set up with the principalities which had become attached to the Reich having legal autonomy and so on and so forth. We want democratic but centralist, i.e. that we want a central government which can take decisions and which can override the localities, which doesn't mean that it should all the time override the localities. And that goes back again to Marx and Engels on Germany. We don't want this stupid half-federal lash-up of North German Confederation. We want a democratic, unitary democratic German Republic. Okay, so why are the Mensheviks then saying the organisations, that is the branches of the RSDLP, should be democratic centralist? The answer is the context of this debate is the Bund, the Jewish socialist group. And the Bund was arguing that the Bund should organise all Jews. And similarly, the Latvian organisation should organise all Latvians wherever in Russia they were. The Lithuanian organisation should organise all Lithuanians wherever they were, etc. I.e. that the party should be federalised on national lines, which actually the Austrian Social Democratic Party at this time was federalised on national lines. So when the Mensheviks bring in, we want democratic centralist party, that's what they mean. We don't want a party which is federalised on national lines, but one in which the branches
are capable of taking decisions which bind all their members, whether they're of Russian origin, Jewish origin, Polish origin, whatever they are. Then that becomes, having been brought in by the Mensheviks, it's then adopted by the Unification Congress. And nobody makes any more sense of it. Lenin talks about the principle of unity in action and freedom of discussion. Doesn't talk about democratic centralism. People only start talking about democratic centralism as a principle after the Russian Revolution. Except in the context of talking about the national question. When they talk about democratic centralism as a principle before the Russian Revolution, they're talking about the national question. And they're talking about federalism, national federalism, Bundism, Bauer, or these questions about do we have a unitary state or a state divided into nationality corporations or whatever it may be. Okay. Then it becomes in the it becomes the label under which the battle is fought out between Lenin and Trotsky on the one hand and the left communists and the military opposition on the other, is the party to be capable of taking decisions on an all-Russian scale which say we're going to withdraw hundreds of troops from here and take them somewhere else. Or is the Stalingrad, well, what became the Tsaritsyn command, entitled to hold on to its soldiers and pursue a policy independent of central government? And out of that it morphs into democratic centralism, becomes the label for Bolshevik-style party organisation. Okay, so what is it? I think the answer, there is a positive side. We say democratic centralism, not bureaucratic centralism. What we mean, I think, by that, we have to be able to take decisions at the national, or for that matter, the international level. It has to be possible for those decisions at the national or the international level to override what comrades want to do in the localities. Take, for example, John Pearson insisted that Stockport Socialist Alliance's mandate overrode the common line of the CPGB so that he should vote with the Alliance for Workers' Liberty on the question of respect before respect was formed. AWL put up a resolution that it would be unprincipled to enter into any alliance with George Galloway on any terms whatever. John Pearson says, okay, I'm a CPGB member, but as a member of Stockport Socialist Alliance, that's more important than my being a CPGB member. That sort of localism, if you actually carry through on localism, or for that matter on the Bund's idea that the party is to be a series of national caucuses. Or many years back I was involved in a campaign for legislation for lesbian and gay rights. We put up a manifesto and organised quite a big conference. The trouble was that because of autonomism, it was agreed in the standing orders of the conference that all of the groups would have veto, all of the caucuses would have vetoes. So the Youth Caucus vetoed any text which didn't include abolition of the age of consent. The Lesbian Mothers Caucus vetoed any text which did include abolition of the age of consent.
You wind up with nothing in that sense. I haven't said anything about the I haven't said anything about the splits and divisions in the Trotskyist movement, but we'd better leave that since I've wittered on too long anyhow.
Another time.